Across many industrial towns in America, there are buildings that once powered entire communities. Factories that ran day and night. Machines that never stopped moving. And thousands of workers who depended on those factories for their livelihoods. For decades, these places were the heart of their towns. But when industries change and companies move away, the factories often fall silent. And when the machines stop, the towns around them slowly begin to fade. One of those towns was Riverton. Riverton was a small manufacturing town located near a river and a railway line that once connected it to major cities. 50 years earlier, Riverton had been a busy place. The streets were filled with workers every morning. Local diners served breakfast before sunrise. And the factory at the edge of town never seemed to sleep. The building was massive. A long red brick structure stretching across several acres beside the railroad tracks. Inside, hundreds of machines produced metal tools and industrial parts that were shipped across the country. For generations, almost every family in Riverton had someone who worked in that factory. Parents, children, neighbors. The factory wasn't just a workplace. It was the reason the town existed. But over time, things began to change. Global manufacturing shifted. New factories opened overseas, and companies started looking for cheaper production. Slowly, orders at the Riverton factory began to decline. First, a few departments were closed. Then several machines were shut down. Workers started losing their jobs. And finally, one winter morning, the announcement came. The factory would be closing permanently. Within weeks, hundreds of workers were gone. The machines were turned off. The gates were locked. And the building that once powered the entire town became silent. At first, people believed another company might buy the factory. But months passed, then years, and nothing changed. The once busy building slowly became something else. An abandoned factory. Windows broke. Rust spread across the old machinery inside. Weeds grew through the cracked pavement in the parking lot. And eventually, people in Riverton stopped even talking about it. The factory had become a reminder of what the town had lost. For nearly 15 years, the massive building stood empty. Most investors avoided it. The repairs would be expensive. The machines were outdated. And many people believed manufacturing in Riverton would never return. But one afternoon, a man driving through town noticed something different. His name was Lucas Bennett. Lucas Bennett was an industrial engineer who had spent years working in manufacturing companies across the country. Unlike many investors who avoided old factories, Lucas had a strange interest in them. He liked studying how factories worked, how production lines were designed, and how older industrial systems could sometimes be rebuilt in smarter ways. One afternoon, while traveling between cities for a consulting project, Lucas passed through Riverton. He wasn't planning to stop, but as he drove past the edge of town, he noticed the factory. Even after years of neglect, the building was impossible to miss. The tall brick walls, the enormous smokestack rising into the sky, and the long rows of dark windows that once looked out over a busy industrial yard. Lucas slowed his car and pulled into the empty parking lot. The place felt quiet, almost frozen in time. Rusty gates stood open. Old rail tracks ran beside the building, and the wind moved through the empty yard. Most people would have seen a dying factory, but Lucas noticed something else. The building itself was still strong. The structure was solid. The railway line still existed. And the factory was located only a few miles from a major highway, which meant something interesting. The factory wasn't in the wrong place. It had simply been abandoned. Lucas walked slowly around the outside of the building, studying its design. Large loading docks, massive interior floors, heavy electrical systems. This wasn't a small workshop. It had once been a serious manufacturing operation. And the more Lucas studied the factory, the more a strange idea began forming in his mind. What if the factory wasn't finished? What if it had simply been waiting for someone to restart it? Because sometimes the biggest opportunities aren't found in brand new buildings. Sometimes they're hidden inside the places everyone else has already given up on. And before Lucas Bennett left Riverton that afternoon, he made a decision that would surprise the entire town. He wanted to buy the factory. When the people of Riverton first heard that someone wanted to buy the abandoned factory, the news spread quickly. In a small town, news always travels fast, especially when it involves something as big as the old factory. For years, that building had been nothing more than a reminder of what Riverton had lost. So when the mayor's office confirmed that an industrial engineer named Lucas Bennett was negotiating to buy it, Most residents reacted with confusion. At the diner on Main Street, the conversation quickly turned to the same question. Why would anyone want that place? One former factory worker shook his head. That building has been dead for 15 years. Another man added, the machines are probably rusted beyond repair. And honestly, they weren't wrong. When Lucas first entered the building after purchasing it, the condition inside looked worse than anyone expected. The factory floor stretched across thousands of square meters. Rows of massive industrial machines sat covered in rust and dust. Broken conveyor belts hung from the ceilings. Electrical panels were outdated. Old paperwork and tools were scattered across the floor. The silence inside the building felt heavy. For a moment, even Lucas stood quietly looking across the empty production lines. 15 years earlier, hundreds of workers had filled this room. Now it looked like time had simply stopped. But Lucas didn't see a graveyard. He saw a blueprint. Because Lucas had spent years studying industrial manufacturing systems, he understood something that many investors didn't. Old factories sometimes fail not because the buildings are useless, but because the technology inside them becomes outdated. And if the right systems were rebuilt, the factory could work again. But the first challenge was obvious. Before anything could restart, the entire building had to be cleaned and repaired. Lucas began by hiring a small team of engineers and technicians. Many of them were surprised when they arrived at the factory for the first time. One engineer looked around the silent building and asked the question everyone was thinking. You really think this place can run again? Lucas smiled slightly. Not the way it used to, but maybe better. The first weeks were slow. Cleaning crews removed years of dust and debris from the factory floor. Broken equipment was taken apart. Electrical systems were inspected. Some of the machines were so damaged they had to be completely removed. Others were old, but still surprisingly strong. And one by one, Lucas began making decisions. Which machines could be repaired? Which machines should be replaced? Which production lines needed to be redesigned entirely? Outside the factory, the town watched with curiosity. For the first time in 15 years, trucks and workers were moving in and out of the building again. Construction lights appeared at night. Repair crews arrived early in the morning. And slowly, the old factory started showing signs of life. Still, many residents remained skeptical. At the diner, former workers continued debating the situation. One man who had worked at the factory for 30 years said, I'll believe it when I hear the machines running again. And honestly, restarting a factory was not easy. Lucas quickly discovered that repairing the building was only one part of the problem. The bigger challenge was figuring out what the factory would actually produce. The original factory had manufactured metal tools, but the global market for those products had changed dramatically. Competing with overseas factories on the same products would almost certainly fail again. So Lucas made a different decision. Instead of rebuilding the old production lines, he redesigned the factory for something new. Specialized precision components, industrial parts used in modern equipment, products that required advanced machinery and skilled technicians. It was a risk, but it was also a strategy, because those types of products were harder to outsource overseas. And factories producing specialized parts could survive in smaller towns like Riverton. Over the next several months, new equipment began arriving. Massive crates were delivered to the factory floor. Inside them were modern manufacturing machines, computer-controlled cutting systems, high-precision metal fabrication tools, and advanced assembly equipment. For the first time in decades, the inside of the factory looked modern again. Old rusty machines were replaced with new production lines. New wiring ran through the walls. Computer systems were installed. And slowly, the empty building began transforming into something else. A modern manufacturing facility. But one final problem remained. Even if the factory could run again, who would work there? Many of the original factory workers had moved away years earlier. Others had retired. And restarting production required skilled technicians. So Lucas made another unexpected decision. Instead of searching only for experienced workers, he began recruiting people directly from Riverton. Young residents, former factory employees, even people who had never worked in manufacturing before. Then he partnered with a nearby technical college to create training programs inside the factory. People who joined the program would learn how to operate the new machines, how to maintain modern production equipment, and how advanced manufacturing actually worked. At first, only a small group signed up. But slowly, the number of trainees began growing. because people in Riverton started realizing something important. The factory might actually return. Months passed. Repairs continued. Machines were installed. Training programs expanded. And one day, the moment everyone in Riverton had been waiting for finally arrived. Lucas announced that the factory was ready to begin testing its production lines. That morning, several former factory workers gathered outside the building. Some of them had not entered the factory in years. They stood quietly watching the entrance doors, waiting. Inside the building, technicians prepared the machines. Computer screens lit up. Conveyor systems were checked. And Lucas walked slowly across the factory floor toward the control panel. For 15 years, this building had been silent. But that silence was about to end. Lucas pressed the start button. And moments later, the first machine roared back to life. When Lucas Bennett pressed the start button inside the Riverton factory, the sound that followed felt almost unbelievable. At first, it was just a low mechanical hum. Then another machine came online. Then another. One by one, the silent production lines that had been inactive for 15 years began to move again. Motors started spinning. Metal cutters began slicing through steel. Conveyor belts slowly rolled forward. And inside the massive building that had once been completely quiet, the sound of industry returned. For a moment, many of the workers simply stood there listening. Because the sound of machines running again inside the Riverton factory was something the town had not heard in a very long time. Outside the building, a small group of former factory workers had gathered near the entrance. Many of them had worked in that same factory decades earlier. They had watched it close. They had watched the town struggle afterward. And now they were standing outside again, waiting to see if the factory could truly come back to life. When the large doors finally opened and the sound of the machines echoed across the yard, several of them looked at each other in disbelief. One of the older workers smiled slowly. I never thought I'd hear that sound again. Inside the factory, the first production run was only a test. The new machines had to be calibrated. Engineers checked the quality of each component produced. Technicians adjusted the systems. But even during those early tests, something important became clear. The factory could work again. And when that news spread across Riverton, the atmosphere of the town began to change. For years, people had associated the factory with loss. Lost jobs. Lost businesses. Lost opportunity. But now the same building was beginning to represent something else. Possibility. Within the first few months after restarting the machines, Lucas began hiring additional workers. The training program that had started with only a handful of people expanded quickly. Young residents who had once believed they would need to leave Riverton to find work now had another option. Former factory workers returned to the building where they had spent most of their careers. And for the first time in more than a decade, the factory parking lot slowly began filling again. Pickup trucks arrived before sunrise. Workers walked through the gates carrying lunchboxes. And the factory that once stood silent was beginning to resemble the place it had been long ago. But the new factory was different in one important way. It was smaller, more specialized, and far more advanced than the original operation. Instead of producing large quantities of simple tools, the factory now focused on precision components used in modern industrial equipment. These parts required careful engineering and advanced machinery, which meant the factory didn't need thousands of workers. But the jobs it created were stable, and the products were in high demand. Within a year, the factory had secured contracts with several manufacturing companies across the country. Orders increased, production lines expanded, and the building that many investors once believed was worthless had become something valuable again. As the factory grew, the effects began spreading across Riverton. Local businesses started noticing the change. The diner that once struggled to stay open began serving breakfast to factory workers again. A small hardware store reopened on Main Street. A trucking company opened a logistics office near the railway line to transport the factory's products. Slowly, the economic life of the town began returning. But perhaps the most noticeable change was something harder to measure. Hope. For years, many people in Riverton believed their town had already passed its best days. The factory had closed. Young people had moved away, and the future seemed uncertain. But seeing the factory operating again changed the way people looked at their town. Because if one abandoned building could come back to life, maybe the town itself could too. Several years later, Riverton looked different than it had during the long, quiet years. The factory continued operating. The parking lot remained full, and the sound of machines working echoed across the river valley every morning. One afternoon, a reporter visited the town to write a story about the factory's comeback. He walked through the building with Lucas Bennett while workers operated the production lines around them. The reporter looked across the factory floor before asking the question many people had wondered for years. When you first saw this place, did you really believe it could work again? Lucas paused for a moment before answering. When I first arrived, most people saw an abandoned factory. But what I saw was a structure that still had potential. He gestured toward the machines running around them. Factories don't fail because the buildings disappear. They fail when people stop believing they can be used again. Outside the factory, the afternoon sun reflected off the tall smokestack rising above the building. The same smokestack that had once stood as a reminder of the town's decline. Now it marked something else. A comeback. Riverton never became a huge industrial city again. That was never Lucas's goal. But it became something far more important. A town that believed in its future again. All because one person looked at an abandoned factory and saw something that everyone else had missed. Sometimes opportunity isn't hidden in the newest buildings. Sometimes it waits quietly inside the places everyone else has already given up on. And sometimes, all it takes to bring a place back to life is the courage to press the start button. A few departments were closed. Then several machines were shut down. Workers started losing their jobs. And finally, one winter morning, the announcement came. The factory would be closing permanently. Within weeks, hundreds of workers were gone. The machines were turned off. The gates were locked. And the building that once powered the entire town became silent. At first, people believed another company might buy the factory. But months passed, then years, and nothing changed. The once busy building slowly became something else. An abandoned factory. Windows broke. Rust spread across the old machinery inside. Weeds grew through the cracked pavement in the parking lot. And eventually, people in Riverton stopped even talking about it. The factory had become a reminder of what the town had lost. For nearly 15 years, the massive building stood empty. Most investors avoided it. The repairs would be expensive. The machines were outdated. And many people believed manufacturing in Riverton would never return. But one afternoon, a man driving through town noticed something different. His name was Lucas Bennett. Lucas Bennett was an industrial engineer who had spent years working in manufacturing companies across the country. Unlike many investors who avoided old factories, Lucas had a strange interest in them. He liked studying how factories worked, how production lines were designed, and how older industrial systems could sometimes be rebuilt in smarter ways. One afternoon, while traveling between cities for a consulting project, Lucas passed through Riverton. He wasn't planning to stop, but as he drove past the edge of town, he noticed the factory. Even after years of neglect, the building was impossible to miss. The tall brick walls, the enormous smokestack rising into the sky, and the long rows of dark windows that once looked out over a busy industrial yard. Lucas slowed his car and pulled into the